This video will cover the structure of the eye as well as the function of those structures. This is the eye. The eye is divided into two cavities, the posterior and the anterior cavity. The ciliary bodies, which I just drew, and the lens right here divide the eye into that posterior and anterior cavity. The anterior cavity has two parts, the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. To remember where these chambers are, a little terminology from anatomy comes into play. Let's draw a little person right here. This is his nose. He's looking forward like this. Anterior and posterior refer to planes of the body. I like to think of anterior as being on the abdominal side, A for anterior and A for abdomen. So this whole frontal area is the anterior region, whereas the posterior region is behind the body, back here. I think of posture and posterior together. So looking at the eye, the anterior side is the frontal side of the body, and the posterior side is the rear side of the body. As you can see, the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber are located in the anterior cavity. The anterior chamber contains the pupil, the iris, and the cornea. The posterior chamber contains the lens and the ciliary body. A clear fluid called the aqueous humor fills this entire anterior cavity and is responsible for maintaining intraocular pressure, or the pressure within the eye, as well as carrying waste and nutrient products back and forth. Let's delve into these structures of the anterior chamber. So we have your pupil, which allows light to enter the eye. If you look in the mirror, it's the black circle in the center of your eye. The iris may be the first thing that you notice about a person. It contains blood vessels and pigment cells, which are responsible for the color of your eye. You can see the iris right here. Most importantly, the iris is composed of pupillary muscles. Pupillary mean related to the pupil. So there are two types of pupillary muscles. The first type is pupillary dilator muscles. When these contract, the size of the pupil increases, meaning the pupil dilates. This occurs in low light areas and is a sympathetic response, a sympathetic nervous response. The second type of pupillary muscle is the pupillary constrictor muscle. When these contract, the pupil constricts, meaning the diameter of the pupil decreases. And this occurs in highlight areas and is a parasympathetic response. Now remember that the light entering your eye is what allows us to perceive images. So in a low light situation, you need more light to see. So that's why your pupil gets larger. And in highlight situations, the opposite occurs. So that's why you have these two types of muscles. In addition, in the anterior chamber, you have the cornea, which is a thin, clear, non-vascular layer, but if damaged, can result in blindness. It's the most sensitive portion of the eye. Most of the eye is covered in the sclera. It's a tough outer layer that covers this whole eye. I'm just going to draw a part of the sclera here, but imagine this going around the whole eye. And on top of the sclera is a mucous membrane called the conjunctiva. So when you have conjunctivitis, that's because your conjunctiva is inflamed. So let's do a quick review of the anterior cavity. The anterior cavity has an anterior chamber in which you have the pupil, the iris, and the cornea. Then behind that, you have your posterior chamber of the anterior cavity in which you have the lens, the ciliary body. The ciliary body contains ciliary muscles to which the suspensory ligaments of the lens attach. This essentially just allows the lens to remain centered on the pupil so that when light enters the eye, it will hit the lens and get refracted backwards. So back here, we're going to talk about your posterior chamber. Now remember that the eye has 3 layers. There's your outermost layer, which is the conjunctiva and sclera, which essentially provide protection for the eye. Then your second layer, you have a choroid. The choroid is a vascular layer inside the eye. Let's just draw this right here. And this contains blood vessels, capillaries that carry nutrients to the eye. This is the innermost layer of the eye. It contains the retina and, of course, the optic disc, which ultimately leads to the optic nerve. So our third layer, retina and optic disc. That optic disc is right here. The retina contains rods and cones. So the rods allow us to see in dim light situations. Just remember, dark and rods. Both of those have an R in them. Cones allow us to see color vision. So that's also similarly easy to remember, color cones. So in your retina you have these cones and rods distributed throughout, but there is an area which has a higher concentration of cones. This area with the highest concentration of cones is known as the macula. In the middle of the macula, there's a spot called the fovea. And here is only cones, the ultimately highest concentration. So if you're looking at an object in the dark and you're looking directly at it, your eye will be sending this light directly back towards this fovea. Now remember, if you're in the dark, you need rods in order to perceive what's going on in that dim light situation. But if you're looking directly at an object, that light is going to be hitting that fovea where we have no rods. So it's going to be very difficult to see the object. So let's take a closer look at what's going on in the retina. Let's use this as representative of a close-up of our retina. So the very first layer of the retina is this pigmented part of the retina, which helps absorb light. After this pigmented part, you have your rods and your cones. So this is a cone. Let's draw a few more cones. This is immediately after that pigmented part. And then you have your rods, which will be here. So what is going to happen in your eye is that light is going to enter the eye and be reflected onto the retina. The light is going to pass through that pigmented layer, and then it's going to hit these rods and cones. The rods have pigments in them, which will decompose and result in an electric impulse, a signal being sent to a nerve cell. There are quite a few nerve cells in your retina, and these nerve cells ultimately help carry that image to your brain, which allows us to see. So right after the rods and cones, we have this layer of bipolar cells. Bipolar cells are a nerve cell. And what's interesting is that for every one cone, there is one bipolar cell, but for the rods, multiple rods will converge, meaning send their signal to a bipolar cell. And this is why your night vision is not as crisp, because of that convergence, because of multiple rods converging on one nerve cell. So this is our layer of bipolar nerve cells. After the bipolar nerve cells, we have the ganglion cells right here. So the bipolar cells synapse on the ganglion. And in addition to the ganglion, we also have these amacrine cells, which are these horizontal nerve cells that get involved here and kind of mediate that synaptic flow. And this can result in us filtering, perceiving information in different ways. And all these ganglion will converge onto the optic disc, which, as I said earlier, leads to the optic nerve. So we have the ganglion and the amacrine cells in this layer. So the optic disc is known as the blind spot because light striking this area is not processed. And this, all of these structures in the eye that we discussed earlier, this is how we perceive the world around us.